So I'm going to introduce the three speakers all right now at the same time. They're going to come sequentially give three slide-based presentations. Then we'll take a moment to discuss amongst ourselves and then open it up to questions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. Our first panelist is Ludwig Straub. He is professor of economics at Harvard University. His research is in macro and international economics, and his work focuses on some of the central questions in the field right now, and indeed in public discourse, why the natural rate of interest has declined so persistently, the macro consequences of rising private and public debt, very related to our panel, obviously, and how monetary and fiscal policy transmit through an economy with heterogeneous households and firms. He also has some new work on the short-run effects of tariff shocks, so you might want to add in today's news into the various shocks you're using in that paper. So Ludwig did his undergraduate work in physics in Munich, followed by a master's in mathematics at Trinity College, Cambridge, and a PhD in economics at MIT. He joined Harvard in 2019 and is the recipient of a Sloan Research Fellowship. Our second panelist is Julia Fonseca, Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So Julia's research sits at the intersection of household finance, development, and labor. A theme that kind of connects her work is understanding how access to credit in financial markets shape outcomes for workers and households. Of particular interest in the panel is her work on mortgage lock-in, the phenomenon where homeowners with a sort of a good fixed rate mortgage are reluctant to move and thus give up their rate. Julia did her undergraduate and master's work in Brazil at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro before coming to Princeton and completing her PhD in economics in 2019. And Julia just mentioned this is her first time back since graduation, so we're very happy to welcome her back to campus. She's an associate editor at the Journal of Finance and the Review of Finance. Our final panelist is Alexandre Gaillard, works in macro with a focus on inequality, entrepreneurship, and trade. A common thread running through his research is understanding how economic inequality is generated and sustained across the distribution, over business cycles, and through the lens of who becomes an entrepreneur and why. Alexandre did his PhD at the Toulouse School of Economics and was a postdoc here, is that correct, at the center? And it's funny, I was just noticing we usually put a star and then the year of graduation for our PhD students. So I think we're claiming you as a postdoc, as one of our PhD students. So I hope that's okay. So he did his postdoc here at the Julis-Rabinowitz Center and then went on to start an assistant professorship at Brown University. So I will start by welcoming Ludwig to the panel, to the podium.
It's truly a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate at the conference. I've really followed with great interest the work done at the center over the last few years and done in this wonderful building. And I can only look ahead to what will come out of the center over the next couple of years. As Ilyana said, I'm based at Harvard, and as was pointed out last night, is that we're also trying to get a better building than what we currently have. Whenever I enter this one, I'm hopeful that maybe we can just even get close to this one, and that would be would make me very happy. So what I'll do in my brief remarks is I'll provide a bit of an overview of some of the work that I have done in joint work with Atif and Amr Soufi over the last couple of years. And I'm not going to go into too much detail in any of the individual projects because I don't want to tip the balance between your appetite for economics and your appetite for actual food, which comes after our session. So I'm going to keep it as brief as I can. Okay, so one, I think, natural starting point to explain our joint work can be this simple plot. This is a kind of plot that you've probably all seen in different forms and shapes. This shows you the top 1% share of the US income, overall income distribution. And you see basically over the last 50 years, it's risen from about 10% to over 20% most recently. In fact, post-COVID, we've done seen another big increase. Now, there's a ton of work on the exact reasons why we've seen that increase, and I'm not going to speculate too much around that. I leave it at that two observations. One is there was a general shift away from labor income towards capital income in that period, and capital income tends to be held more by the top tail, so that contributed to this rise. And on top of that, we've had several skill-biased technological, several reasons for skill-biased technological change, such as computerization or automation, that also contributed to that increase in inequality. Now, when I look at this as a macroeconomist, I kind of invariably start asking myself whether this matters for macroeconomic phenomena, right? The fact that some people earn more than others does not necessarily mean that the macroeconomy is any different. And I think the key to understanding whether there are macroeconomic effects of such an increase in inequality is in looking at individual household behavior and seeing whether that behavior is linear or nonlinear in their income. And here's a simple illustration of this applied to the consumption saving decision that many households face. On the left here, you see a very traditional macroeconomic framework that we've been writing for 70 plus years, going back to Milton Friedman's work, that shows a specific type of policy rule where consumption and saving are both linear in income. And under that split, you see that if somebody's income increases, they're going to proportionately attribute that additional income to saving and consumption in the same proportion as if somebody on the left-hand side, on the poor end of the spectrum, sees a reduction in income. So an increase in inequality, if we were in that left-hand side world, would not affect aggregate saving, would not affect aggregate consumption. But it turns out, and this is going back to a large body of work by now, that this is not the world we live in. And in fact, the world we live in is one where the consumption policy function is concave and the saving policy function is very convex in income. So an increase in inequality in that world would reduce consumption, reduce demand, and increase saving. Now, what does this look like with actual data? This is just a sketch. Let me just show you what we found when we looked at actual saving rates across the US income distribution. This shows you a plot from a recent paper with Atif. And we do it two different ways, and the plot, exactly how we do it, is a little bit beyond the scope of the presentation. But you see that going from the left, where the top 1% is shown, to the right, you see that saving rates, by and large, go from around 40 to 50% of after-tax income down closer and closer to zero as you go towards the bottom 50% of the income distribution. So there are huge differences in saving rates across the income distribution. It's not the case that just everybody has the same saving rate, as in many standard models that we've been writing for a long time. So this should mean that an increase in inequality should increase overall saving and overall wealth accumulation in an economy. Do we find any smoking gun evidence of that phenomenon? Well, it turns out that we can do that. We can actually find some within the US even, by considering the US not just as one big country, but as the combination of 50 individual states. And when we rank the individual states by how much of an increase in the top 1% income share they have seen over the last few decades, and then seeing how much additional wealth accumulation they have experienced relative to their income, you see just a very striking positive relationship between the two, kind of complementing that evidence on saving rates. Okay, so increased inequality leads to increased wealth accumulation. Now, in equilibrium, that wealth accumulation has to find some instrument that it is financing, right? There has to be something on the other side of that wealth accumulation. And there are several options for what could be on that other side. One that I haven't even listed is, it could be that rich Americans simply just save in the rest of the world, and that should manifest itself in large current account surpluses, but that's not something we've seen. In fact, we've seen that there was a lot of money coming in from the rest of the world into the US, because in the rest of the world, we've also seen increased inequality, and we've also seen other forces that make the rest of the world want to save in the US, very much related to the previous panel that we just saw. So it's not that rich Americans export all of their saving to the rest of the world. So where does it go? Now, it could go to productive domestic investment, but if anything, the investment to GDP ratio in the US has gone down. So we don't think that's where it ended up going. And so the other two options are basically that it helped increase household debt, or as Michael Pettis said it earlier this morning, reduce aggregate saving or push back on the increase in saving by reducing saving by some other households that are not increasing their saving. And then the last option is basically that it would finance an increase in public debt. And so a lot of our work has focused on those two latter options, that of an increase in household debt or an increase in public debt. So let me focus first on what we found for household debt. And here I just want to illustrate the main mechanisms that we found in our research with a little diagram. So imagine that we have in the US economy a top 1% on the right and the poor and the middle class on the left. And imagine initially in the 1970s, they contributed both actively to aggregate demand, okay? Both were spending, and now we feed in an increase in inequality. So that increase in inequality would mean that now the top 1% get a larger share of overall income, and the bottom 99, the poor and the middle class, get a smaller share of their income. Now, because their consumption is tied more closely to their income, they're going to have to reduce their spending, reduce their demand. But the top 1% are not going to increase their demand by a commensurate amount because their consumption function is concave. And so we have, all else equal, a reduction in demand here and an increase in saving. But if you've taken any economics courses in macro, you know that that's not an equilibrium. There has to be something else that happens. The saving can't just vanish in the banking sector. And so what we saw happen over the last few decades is an increase in lending of banks to households. And this was especially strong in the run-up to the great financial crisis. Now that helped support aggregate demand, helped support spending by the poor and the middle class, but only temporarily, as long as the flow of new loans kept on coming in. But at some point, that flow reverses because new loans are then dominated by, on net, the debt repayment that goes the other direction, okay? And in that case, we have even less aggregate demand than we would have had in the first place by just coming from the increase in inequality. And so that can lead to a crisis, and that is in fact what our research points to as one contributing factor to the great financial crisis and to the Great Recession that followed it. Now, do we see some evidence in the data of, in fact, the top 1% holding household debt on their balance sheets directly or indirectly? And we spent a lot of time going through the US financial accounts and exactly tracing through who are the ultimate owners of the household debt that was increasing so strongly over the 20 years or so before the great financial crisis. And we see that in red here, the top 1% is in fact a large contributing force and a large owner of household debt that ended up leading to the crisis. Now, this is all household debt. What about government debt? Now, during the financial crisis, households started to delever. So one natural question we asked ourselves was, well, where does that additional saving due to the unequal distribution of income go now? given that households are delevering. And it turns out that what was happening is that the government sector just massively expanded debt, partly because it was fighting a recession and it had to do so to stabilize the macroeconomy. But if you ask yourself, why is it possible that government debt increased so much after the Great Recession and during the Great Recession without such a strong increase in interest rates? It turns out that one key factor here is the fact that inequality had increased so much. So in a paper of ours, we try to put numbers on exactly how important increased inequality was for the ability of the US government to issue additional debt without seeing strongly higher interest rates. And this is kind of illustrated in this diagram here, where we show how much of a deficit the US government can afford itself to run as you vary the debt level it is at. The point here in black, that's the pre-COVID US steady state of around, we had around 100% debt to GDP, and we were running around a 2% primary deficit. And then when we take this picture and in our theoretical model and reduce the level of inequality back to what it was in 1980, we see that the amount of deficit that the US government can actually afford itself to run is significantly lower than what it was actually running, underscoring how important it was that we had rich Americans that were happy to hold US government debt. Now, this is important, right? Because when we're thinking about policies to redistribute or to tax more progressively or to soak the rich, right, we tend to forget about the fact that some of the key buyers of government debt are the rich. And if we try to take resources away from them, they're presumably no longer able to buy as much of our debt. And so we might actually have difficulties funding the government with such high debt levels. Perfect. Now, in my last couple of minutes, I just wanted to think about what lies ahead of us in terms of inequality, in terms of dynamics that we could see going forward. And I think this, we've all seen what AI is starting to do to our daily work routines, and it's possible that we're at the beginning of a new technological revolution. And just like the previous ones that happened to be very skill biased, increasing inequality, it is very possible that this one also increases inequality. Now, the data is still too early to tell with full certainty, but when I prepared these remarks, I started to look at the labor share as one indicator of whether we see higher inequality already now. And it turns out that the labor share, just in the post-COVID era, saw a striking decline that is basically, in its speed, unprecedented in the post-World War II era. And now the US labor share has fallen below 57%. So very, very low. And it's possible that this is foreshadowing an further increase in inequality. And so one important question that I think we should ask ourselves is, well, if we see further increases in inequality, what is the additional wealth accumulation that comes from that and ending up financing? And here I saw an interesting paper that I just wanted to briefly mention. That's very speculative, but I thought it gives us a great perspective on what might lie ahead of us. It's a paper by an economist at MIT, Ricardo Caballero, and he kind of points out that in this worldview where higher inequality leads to increased saving, you can kind of get caught up in a feedback mechanism where greater inequality leads to more saving, and in a world of rampant AI investment that can provide much needed funding for additional AI investment. But to the extent that that actually leads to faster job displacement, we could see a greater fall in the labor share and a further increase in inequality. And so that kind of cycle can feed on itself. So with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks here, and I look forward to the panel discussion later. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be back. And today I'm going to be talking about mortgage lock-in, which is this phenomenon of mortgage borrowers foregoing moves so they can hold on to their low mortgage rates. I'm going to talk about just how large of a shock to mobility this actually is, and then lay out some implications for housing markets and labor markets as well. And I should note that all the work that I'm discussing today is joint with Liu at the Wharton School. So maybe you've never heard about mortgage lock-in, but I'm sure you know that mortgage rates rose very sharply starting in 2022. What I'm showing you here are average 30-year fixed rates for prime borrowers. And you can see that we went from lows of about 3% to a high of more than 7%. And we've been hovering above 6% ever since. Meanwhile, most mortgage borrowers have locked in a rate below 4% through their fixed rate mortgages. And if they were to trade in those low rates for the higher current market rate, that would be pretty expensive. So for a borrower with the median loan balance, a 1 percentage point increase in their mortgage rate can increase the present value of payments by up to $35,000. That is per 100 basis points. Okay, so multiply this by 3 if you're trading in a 3% rate for a 6% one. But because of how mortgages work in the US, borrowers don't have to give up their low rate when market rates go up. They can keep that for up to 30 years, so long as they don't move. And so what this increase in mortgage rates is doing effectively is driving up the cost of moving for homeowners. And what I'm showing you here are average moving rates for homeowners from the American Community Survey. This is all homeowners, by the way, not just those with a mortgage. And we're seeing a 22% drop in their mobility since 2021. And meanwhile, if anything, the mobility of renters has ticked up a bit. So are these rising mortgage rates effectively locking these homeowners into their homes? That's the first question that Lou and I try to answer, and our answer is a pretty resounding yes. Mortgage lock-in reduces mobility. So we start from a very simple model that's going to relate moving rates to what we call mortgage deltas. So your mortgage delta is the difference between the mortgage rate that you locked in and whatever the market rate currently is at time t. So for example, my mortgage rate is 2.1%. Current rates are still around 6%. So I'm that dot all the way there to the left with a mortgage delta of almost minus 4%. And so we derive a couple predictions from this model. The first is that locking in a lower rate reduces moving. Or if we flip that relationship, a higher delta increases moving. And what I'm showing you there is a bin scatter plot of individual level data showing mobility against a measure of people's mortgage deltas. And you can see that increasing relationship very clearly. But a second prediction of our model is perhaps a little less obvious, and that is that this is true up to a point. When deltas get large enough, meaning your locked-in rate is sufficiently larger than the current rate, it makes sense for you to pay the cost to refinance and reset your rate. So from that point onward, resetting your rates isn't adding to your cost of moving, it's actually a financial benefit. But the thing is that you don't have to move to reset your rate. You can just refinance. From that point onward, there's no longer any relationship between interest rates and moving. So we see that in the data as well. So when deltas, there's this kink there at around 1.8% of mortgage balances, which is roughly what we think the cost of refinancing is. And beyond that, this relationship just sort of flattens. And so what else do we do in this paper? We come up with an approach to estimate that causal effect of mortgage rates on moving. We're going to exploit individual level variation in mortgage origination timing and also aggregate variation in market rates. And we find that a 1 percentage point decline in these mortgage deltas, so for instance, because the market rate increased by 1 percentage point, that reduces moving by about 9%. So if you want to do a very naive linear extrapolation, you would multiply this by 3 because deltas went down by about 3 percentage points since 2022. So you would predict that moving rates for borrowers would decline by about 27%. Now this sounds similar to the 22% figure I just gave you, but just be careful in comparing those two, because the 22% in the data was for all homeowners. If we were to look just at mortgage borrowers, we would probably see a steeper decline. Now, in this paper, we also have some suggestive evidence that when homeowners are more locked in an area, that drives up house prices in that area. And also that these locked-in homeowners are less willing to reallocate toward better employment opportunities. Now, why am I calling this suggestive? Because just the assumptions underlying these results are much stronger than the ones behind that 9% estimate that I just gave you. They're maybe implausibly strong, if I'm being super honest. So what we did is we kept pulling on these two threads to see if we could reach a level of confidence in our understanding of how lock-in is impacting those markets as we feel about our mobility results. And so we started with housing markets. And I think it's pretty plausible that lock-in would be propping up house prices because they've been surprisingly stable in the United States despite some pretty aggressive monetary tightening. And that's very different than what we've seen in other countries where borrowers can't lock in rates for as long. The US really is an outlier when it comes to mortgage fixation length. Now, I should note that when we started presenting our mobility results, the one that I just went over, these went over very well with people. Maybe because so many of us are locked in and sort of grappling with the effects of that on our own moving decisions. When we started making this argument that lock-in was driving up house prices, to put this very mildly, it didn't go well. So what we heard from other economists, which, by the way, is all extremely reasonable, is the following. In the US, the vast majority of home sales, the seller is buying another home. Okay? And so if that homeowner is locked in and they're not selling, that means they're not buying a home somewhere else. So lock-in is reducing both supply and demand. That's going to wash out, so lock-in can't affect prices. Now, again, this is a very reasonable mental model, but the underlying assumption that we think is leading this model astray is that the home that would be sold is very similar to the one that would be bought. This doesn't have to be true in practice. So we wrote another paper, this time with Pierre Mabille, and we start from a very simple excess demand framework, which is basically that mental model that economists were using to parse our initial findings, but we relax this assumption that housing is homogeneous. And what comes out of that version of the model is that lock-in can drive prices up or down. It really depends on what these missing movers would have done, but for lock-in. So would they have traded up and bought a larger home than the one they would be selling? If so, but for lock-in, the demand for housing would be higher. Alternatively, it could be that they would have downsized and bought a smaller home than the one they were selling, or maybe even become renters. If so, they would be freeing housing up were it not for lock-in. So where we start is by taking this to the data and showing empirically that the missing movers are downsizers. Now, I personally find this very intuitive because downsizing is really a financial decision. There are plenty of reasons why you need more space for your housing consumption needs. There's no real reason why you need less space, right? There's a whole floor of your home that you don't need. Just maybe don't go up there, right? And so because lock-in is adding to the cost of moving, it's affecting these purely financial moves a lot more than moves to larger homes where there are other motives for it. And so what does this mean? It means that lock-in is driving up the net demand for housing, and so it's pushing house prices up. This is basically the entire intuition of our paper, and then we spend the next 70 pages just coming up with the most credible estimate that we possibly can of the effect of lock-in on house prices and rents in equilibrium. I'm going to spare you from that. I'll just say that we built a state-of-the-art equilibrium housing model where households can choose to rent or to buy homes of different sizes in different areas. They're making these moving decisions endogenously at the same time that they're also choosing whether to borrow and how much to borrow. So when we shock that model with higher interest rates, lock-in arises endogenously because some households will have locked in lower rates. And we want to take our estimates seriously. And so we hold this model to a very high standard. It fits the data quite beautifully. And in particular, it generates a distribution of locked-in rates that looks a lot like the data. And it even hits that causal effect of mobility that I just talked about. So that decline of 9% per 100 basis point increase in interest rates. And by the way, we do all of that out of sample. We don't target these moments in any way. And so once we've convinced ourselves and hopefully others that we have a very good model, we look at two versions of the world according to this model. In both versions, we're going to increase mortgage rates by 3 percentage points. But in one of them, there will be lock-in, and in the other, there's not. And what we find is that house prices, on average, are 4% higher when there is lock-in. So this is, a summary of that housing market thread that I said that we were pulling on. And there was another that I mentioned, which is about labor reallocation. This one's still very much ongoing, and here we're teaming up with Lauren Lambie-Hansen and Slava Mikid at the Philly Fed. We would love to have a paper out this year, but that is still TBD. But as with housing markets, we think it's very plausible that lock-in is reducing labor reallocation. For one, because the typical mortgage borrower has a job, and we know that they're not moving to the same extent. But also, if you look at aggregate data, it does seem like Americans are less willing to switch jobs since 2022, here measured by quit rates from jobs. We do have some preliminary evidence that there's a large causal effect here, that lock-in is substantially reducing job switching. But we also want to think about the effect of this lower mobility on wages so that we can learn more about its economic consequences. And this is another instance where there's a lot going on, and a little theory is going to be helpful because lock-in can affect wages in a lot of different ways. So if workers really are less willing to reallocate for jobs, we would expect the quality of the match between a worker and a job to decline. So that would drive wages down. It would also mean that lock-in has this pretty important economic impact of lowering labor productivity. But lock-in can also affect the relative bargaining power of employees and employers as well. Because if I'm a worker and I'm locked in, it's costlier for me to move. That's going to lower my outside option, give my employer more bargaining power. On the flip side, if everyone else is locked in, it becomes harder to replace my current worker. So that might reduce the bargaining power of firms. So what I'm trying to say is that it's even directionally unclear what, if anything, lock-in is going to do to wages. So where we are is we're sorting through this with a very simple labor search model, and we're building two very exciting data sets linking credit and employment outcomes. So we have one sample of credit records that's going to be linked to administrative wage data from the census, and yet another sample that we're linking to online platforms like LinkedIn profiles. And the advantage of doing that is that there we're going to be able to see past employment history, education, and also self-reported skills, because we're working on a new method to assess that quality of the fit between workers and jobs. So this is all still ongoing. I'm going to have to get back to you on this labor question, but our initial findings suggest that lock-in does have an important effect on labor markets. So let me leave you with the takeaway that mortgage lock-in is the biggest shock to household mobility in recent US history, and that this lower mobility matters. It matters for housing markets and potentially also for labor markets. It matters for which homes are allocated to which households, and potentially also which workers are allocated to which jobs. We might care about these impacts because they're important for these individuals, but also because it's important for the economy. For instance, in at least one of these markets, we have good evidence that lock-in is driving up prices. And if lock-in is affecting housing costs and wages, that's going to feed right back into the inflation that we're raising rates to fight. So understanding and quantifying these mechanisms becomes also important for better understanding the transmission of monetary policy. So that is all I have. Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
So thanks for the invitation. Very happy to be here again at Princeton. So I'm not going to present like a paper I did in the past, so it's going to be more about a research agenda I have for the future years. And it's going to be more about the bottom inequality, and I should add extreme poverty in the wealthy nations in the 21st century, to be closer to the title of the conference. And so the starting point of this paper is, we have a lot of knowledge about the top inequality, and Ludwig talked about it in his talk. I have also a paper on that. What are the main determinants of wealth accumulation? Is it because we have concave utility function, consumption function, and so on and so forth? The thing is, we have very few data on the very bottom. And when I'm talking about the very bottom, I'm talking about the homeless people or the very poor in the economy. Why is that? It's because when you think about survey, it's actually very hard to interview people. They need to have an address, they need to have a phone number, and so on and so forth. Yet when you think about public policies and when you think about redistribution, this margin of the population is going to be the most important one for the welfare. So what we're going to do in this paper, but more broadly in this research agenda, is to use new data about the very bottom of the distribution. It's going to be data for France today. And the particularity of this data is that it's going to be large scale. So we're going to have 2% of the population, so it's going to be millions of individuals every 6 months. And it's going to be a panel. So we're going to be able to follow the homeless people over time, and we're going to be able to follow their behavior and so on and so forth. What we're going to do with this data is to first study their profile, who they are, age, sex, and everything. We're going to be able to observe income and also debt, okay? Consumption, so we're going to be able to observe food consumption, housing consumption, and so on. Related to what Julia was talking about, we're going to be able to observe migration across location and so on. So I'm going to talk about a few key results today. The first one is when you look at France and the risk of the exposure of the population to poverty, in fact, you find that it's pretty large. Over 7 years of data, we have that 5% of the population falls into poverty. And when you look at homelessness, it's going to be about 0.6%. So a large fraction of the population is experiencing such situation over the 7 years. The second thing, which is going to be striking, is an asymmetry. So when you regress some macro variables on the entry into homelessness and the exit from homelessness, what you're going to find is that macro variables are going to be important for the entry, but not for the exit. Okay, so the entry is going to be where you live, and the exit is going to be more about who they are. And the last thing, if I have time, I'm going to talk about how those people are going to absorb income shocks by changing their consumption behavior. Okay. So just to fix the idea of the project, so here I'm showing you two things. On the left, you have the ranking of the OECD countries in terms of homelessness rate. Okay, I'm guessing you are surprised here to see that the USA is below UK and France and some other European countries. But in fact, those numbers might be underestimated for the US, but they seem to be consistent across datasets. So why is that the case that in France and the UK and to some extent in Germany you have high homelessness rate? It's also due to immigration. So lots of illegal immigrants coming to Europe are going to face homelessness. So today I'm going to focus on the resident homeless, and I'm going to leave aside the immigrants. On the right, what you have is the dynamics of the series of homelessness rate in 3 countries, France, UK, and the USA. So what I'm interested in today is to understand what are the drivers of this increase in homelessness rate. And just a word on this graph, you see that after COVID, it was increasing in all the countries. And in Europe, it tends to increase since the Great Recession. Okay? So that's what we want to learn in this first paper. What are the key drivers of this trend? What the data we're going to use? It's going to be a data about the largest charity we have in France and probably in Europe. This charity is going to be free of charge. So you go to the charity, and if you satisfy the condition, you're going to be allowed to have some food and some services. You can think about this charity as a monopoly in France. Like everybody knows the Restaurant du Cœur, Restaurant of the Heart. And if you are poor, you're going to go to that one. It's apolitical, it's not related to any religion, and so on. So the goal of this charity is essentially to give food to the people and also some services in terms of social and housing supports. When you go to the charity, you have to give some proofs in terms of income and expenses. That's why we're going to observe consumption pattern and so on. It's going to be biannual in the sense that every 6 months, the people, they have to again provide proofs of their income and expenses. And we're going to observe the accepted ones and the rejected ones. They have ways to, check the accuracy of the expenses and the income, and we're gonna get the data since 2018. In terms of variables, what we're gonna observe a lot actually. So each individual is gonna have a different ID and the household as well. So we're gonna be able to try divorce, track mobility, and also intergenerational persistence of homelessness. We have all the information about demographics. We have a lot of information about the housing status. So if we observe someone who is homeless, we're going to be able to say something on whether he's sleeping in the street, whether he's going to a shelter, and so on and so forth. In terms of household finance, we're going to observe all the types of income, transfers, expenses, and also through some extent the food consumption through the charity. We have a way to send more questions through the charities, and we did it, but I'm not going to discuss that, about the health condition of those people, their expectation about future jobs, their job search behavior, their take-up, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to do is to take all this data, and we're going to merge it with many macro variables at the local level, okay? So we're going to exploit variation, so that's France, not the 63rd state of the United States, so that's France. And you have a lot of variation across location, right? Also across time, and you see that even for the residents, you have an increase in homelessness rate, okay? So I'm going to use that variation to run like two simple two-way fixed effect regression, where I'm going to check on the entry side whether those macro variables at the local level are going to have an impact on the entry rate, and I'm going to do the same on the exit rate, okay? So what you find here is the results, and you have two key variables that are going to increase the entry rate into homelessness. First, the local private rent is going to be very important, but also the local unemployment rate, with an elasticity greater than 1. On the other side, you're going to reduce the entry rate if you have some policies to mitigate homelessness, and it's going to be like the size of the social housing in the locality. It's going to be the mean local revenue, and also to some extent the firm dynamism in the locality. What's striking here is that if you compare entry rate and exit rate, you have nothing significant for the exit rate. And actually, even if you were to look at the economic impact, it's very small, okay? So that's the first asymmetry that I want you to remember at the end of this talk. Then we can do a simple exercise, which is are the poor in France, because in France you have a lot of transfers, like it's a very generous system. So one thing we were interested in is to understand the exposure of the poor to a change in GDP, for example. So here what we started to do is to try to understand if everybody in this room is going to lose 1% of their income, how much is going to, and in the society in general, how much is going to increase homelessness in the economy? And the answer is just from this very simple back of the envelope calculation is going to be an increase by 1.3% of homelessness in the economy. But that's different from the empirical exposure. So in the empirical exposure, what we do here is to try to understand in reality what's the impact of a drop in GDP on the increase in homelessness. And what we can do is to try to first take the elasticities that we were able to estimate in the data between unemployment and homelessness, and the occurrence law in France between GDP and unemployment rate. If you do that calculation, you find that a 1% reduction in GDP actually increased homelessness rate by 5%, 4 to 5% in France. So despite we have a large transfer system in France, we find that the poor are disproportionately exposed to the risk of falling into that type of homelessness situation. And it's going to be, this exposure is going to be even higher if the price level is going to be very high. So it's going to be very different in Paris as compared to the countryside. So what's driving the exit? So we know that the exit is not going to be driven by any macro variables. So here I'm just selecting two key variables that are driving the exit rate from homelessness. The first one is going to be duration dependence, which means that the more you're going to stay in the situation of homelessness, the much harder for you is going to be to leave that situation. And in fact, if you want to leave homelessness, you have to do it in the first or 2 years. Okay. The second variable, which is going to be very important, is actually age. So we observe that the older you are, the much more difficult it's going to be for you to exit that situation, probably due to some physical issues and mental health issue. And the impact is very similar between the duration dependence and the effect of age itself. Lastly, the last thing I want to talk about is how does the people are going to adjust their consumption if they face an income shock. So on the left, what you have is the extensive margin of the housing choice. So if you reduce the income of the people, what you see here is that you're going to have an increase in the probability of becoming homeless or to go in a precarious situation. Precarious means that you're going to go to your parents or you're going to go to the home of your friends. On the right, what you have is the intensive margin, so conditional on being homeless, conditional on being in social housing or private housing, how you're going to change your behavior in terms of consumption. And so here what's striking is before income 500 euros, what you find is that, in fact, the change in terms of consumption housing is very flat. So the MPC of those people is going to be close to zero before 500s. And above that, the people, they start to consume more and more housing. So what we do with that is to think about the subsistence level. So 500 euros is going to tell you the threshold at which you're going to start to consume more and more housing. And before that, it's going to be mostly about food and basic necessities. Okay, so if you have a model of subsistence level and so on, that's one of the key parameters that you can estimate with the data. So the key insight I wanted to talk about today is first this asymmetry that we have in the data between entry and exit. So on the entry side, we observe that macro variables at the local level are going to be important for the entry into homelessness. It's going to be about unemployment, it's going to be about prices and rents and so on. For exit, it's really about who they are, and it's going to be more about age, spell duration, number of children that I didn't show you, but it's in the paper. And on the consumption behavior, we have this subsistence floor that we put forward. A lot more needs to be explored in this research agenda. We are at the beginning of this. What we want to do next is to talk about, what are the key drivers besides the macro variables and so on, knowing more about the health issue, the mental health issue. Drugs also are going to be important, less as compared to the US. We want to understand also whether you have intergenerational persistence in homelessness between the parents and their children. And we want to do like a model of the dynamics of poverty, understanding how we can better design policies to prevent homelessness, how to help people, and so on. That's it. Thank you.
Ludwig, I wanted to ask you about your, I thought, quite provocative point that, but for the rise in inequality, it might have been hard to finance our debt, and that one potential unintended consequence of progressive taxation, soaking the rich, so to speak, might be that it would be harder to finance our debt. So do you really think that, is there an assumption baked in that actually it'd be very hard to raise much revenue from the rich? They would have certain kind of evasive activities, or because you would think at some point, there'll be less debt, right? Because we can grab some of that revenue from the high income taxpayers.
Great to respond right away?
Well, I had one other question, so maybe, I don't know if you want to like take both. It's kind of two separate questions, but you do a lot of comparisons between like, let's say 1979, 80 as sort of your pre-period and then going on to the modern day. And I wondered if you thought about extending it further back until, sort of the post-war decades. So if I think about the 3 decades after World War II, sort of the golden era, so to speak, of the American worker, it's characterized by very low levels of inequality, the lowest, that we've ever been able to measure, with proper data in the U.S. And it's, unless I'm mistaken, actually pretty solid savings rates over that period for the U.S. as a whole. So I just wondered whether, sort of how do you think about that if we're going to incorporate a longer time series?
Perfect. So on your first point, so I did not bake in any assumptions on tax evasion in that chart. It was merely just pointing out that if there is redistribution to an extent that it inhibits the ability of the rich to actually buy the debt that the U.S. government issues, it can come back to bite the government.
I see.
And that's typically ignored when we think about, how much can we raise in tax revenue by taxing the rich. So this is something that happens sort of in equilibrium, right? Once you have the debt market modeled and you have modeled who actually buys the debt. Now, in practice, how large is that effect versus, tax evasion? I think that's something that we probably should study more, but I think it's an important or interesting effect that can happen. I think it's a great suggestion to kind of go back in time more. We've done that somewhat, but I don't think I have the perfect answer for why exactly saving rates were higher post World War II. My guess is that by and large they were higher across the advanced world because there's a lot of sort of pent-up investment that hadn't happened during the world wars, either because of destruction or because we just focused so much of our resources on military production that now the kind of was.
Well, in the U.S., that military production investment continued. There was 10%
That's right.
share of the GDP
Absolutely.
going to defense, and it actually was quite high, surprisingly high for me. I thought that as an American, you have this view that you just pay for Europe's defense. But actually, Canada, UK, France under de Gaulle still were spending almost the same sort of 10% share of GDP on defense as well during that period. So obviously it's that period was so different in so many ways than, the last 40, 50 years. But it did make me think about your model and over a longer time period.
Right. I mean, one thing we did see, just to, so this is the data that I know well. If you look at the household wealth relative to GDP ratio.
Household wealth, okay.
Right. So the stock, that was about 3 in post-World War II and stayed roughly around 3 for quite a while, actually. And then as inequality picks up.
And this is sort of the Piketty, wealth over income, right?
Yeah,
R
exactly. So I don't, I have to think about how do you convert that to your number and where your number comes from. But the stock number is clearly going in exactly that direction.
Very interesting. So Julia, I feel like a very interesting paper. So congratulations on that and on the whole agenda. I feel like you hinted a few times, but maybe didn't say it, and maybe you don't quite have the data, but maybe I'll invite you to speculate that there's sort of a generational, older, in my mind, I'm thinking, older people have the good low rate mortgages, they have this big house, they have a whole floor they don't use. So have you thought about sort of the generational implications of this lock-in? These older people, and again, that's just my mental image, don't want to leave their 5-bedroom colonial. I'm sorry?
Older people got their mortgages before the rates came down.
Or whatever. There's going to be some generation that kind of has a sweet spot. And these downsizing that, isn't happening is, hurting the household formation of people who might want to start families. And I don't know if that's something that you've looked at all, or sort of looked at the age distribution of these effects, or if you would like to speculate as to how that might affect household formation of younger people who, by definition, don't have existing mortgages, or even fertility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is something that we are working on a paper on, but we're just getting started, so I will have to speculate.
Feel free.
But I think it is, I think what you're saying about, people locking in low mortgage rates, that is potentially making it harder for younger people to get into home ownership. I think that is all very plausible. And not just because of low mortgage rates, but if you think of just, demographic shifts, just, the baby boomers are just a huge cohort. And so that, these demographic shifts can also affect how housing is allocated across generations. That's something that we're thinking a lot about. And then a third thing is what happens if and when rates come down. I think in the media, they're calling it the silver tsunami, which
Yes,
may
I've
or
seen
may
that.
not be coming.
I've seen that.
Once all these downsizers start downsizing, what's going to happen to housing? So I think that this is all very plausible, that this is going to meaningfully shift not just house prices, but who owns which types of homes. Right now, anecdotally, we do think that there are a lot of people that feel very constrained about their ability to get into home ownership.
And Alexandre, I know this is something that you mentioned, you really want to look more into, but I was curious if you could just comment a little bit on, health shocks or the health system in, preventing or not doing enough to prevent, homelessness or shifts into extreme poverty. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there isn't really meaningful medical debt in France, which, is obviously a major issue in the US. But I also wondered, just how, mental health, and not just a shock, but, just sort of like steady state challenges in mental health are also, at least in the US, very highly related to homelessness. And there's, big debates about whether people can be committed against their will. If not, the worry is that they would be on the street and be homelessness. So I just wondered, out of my own ignorance, like how these debates have played out in France. And even if, you sort of mentioned that as something you're going to be working on in the future, how policymakers and people in the health system think about that in France.
No, that's a very good question. So that's a lot of speculation, what I'm going to say.
Totally
because
fine,
we
yeah.
We have very few data on the homeless people in the US, so it's going to be more anecdotal. I think, and we think with my co-author, that homelessness in the US is very different from the one we observe in Europe.
Yeah.
In the sense that in the US, it's probably more related to mental health issues and physical issues. And what we observe in France, and again, that's only in France because we can ask directly the people questions about mental health issues and so on. What we observe is that among the homeless people, only like 10 to 15% of the people are saying that they suffer from like depression or something like that.
Or even more severe, like schizophrenia is often
so it's not
common
like
in the US pop.
Yeah, that's not a big fraction of them. So that's not like the main policy I would try to implement, like a better.
Is there a sort of a consensus on sort of involuntary confinement among people that have sort of severe and potentially dangerous mental health conditions? And I wonder if that's part of the difference. This is a big debate in the US that there's, I think, more maybe like a personal liberty tradition where a lot of people feel very uncomfortable with that in the US.
No, that's that's speculative because we don't have enough data, but those people are the one that we see the most probably.
Yeah.
So that's a tiny fraction of all the homeless people both in France, but also I think in the US. So of course that those people are very important, and we need to help them in the best way. But there are also all the other homeless
Right.
where social housing is going to be much more important policy that you can implement, and also like some transfers that you can provide to those people. So in France, for example, you have a threshold at age 25 where you're gonna you're gonna get some subsistence transfers, but before that age, you have nothing. So what we observe in France is that you have a lot of young homeless people because they don't have this type of transfers. So that's the type of policy you can easily implement, just like.
And do you see in your data kind of a discontinuity? Oh, that's amazing.
So that's something we want to exploit, like
I
this
see.
discontinuity at age 25, but also you have another one at retirement.
I
age.
see. So I might ask some more questions, but as we go ahead, but I want to, for the moment, at least open up to the audience. Question right here.
Go without the microphone?
Yeah, I think just give it a try. Yeah.
Question for Julia. There have been periods before when mortgage rates have risen. I don't know if you look back to see if
Yeah.
there's as much of a lock-in effect. One of the periods when that was most dramatic, when I was taking out mortgages, was the 70s and early 80s. In those days, a buyer of a house could assume the mortgage. And that meant that the value of the low interest rate got capitalized into the price of the house and the seller could get it out. That's not true anymore, is that right?
So about 20% of mortgages are assumable, but if you look at actual rates of mortgages being assumed, it is tiny. It's like less than half of a percentage point, which I think is an interesting question in itself. Why are mortgages not being assumed? I think the maybe information frictions, people just don't know how to do it, but I feel like those are being alleviated. Like if you go on Zillow, now it says like assumable mortgage. So if I had to guess why we're still not seeing these mortgages being assumed is because of home equity gains. They still have to make up the difference, right? The homeowner has been paying it down, house prices haven't come up. They're still gonna need that second lien on the equity, and maybe that's just enough to deter people. And with, for instance, VA mortgages, you also have the matching problem that the buyer needs to be VA eligible. We don't have data going as far back as the 70s, which was sort of the other episode. We see this briefly in like the temper tantrum, a little bit in 2017, where you see little spikes in this. But in the data that we do have, it is really 2022. That's the big one.
Yes.
Great panel. My question is for Ludwig. Ludwig, so the last figure you showed, the circle, amazing, right? Inequality to AI and come back and just like keeps feeding each other. So I want to relate this to what Ken said yesterday, right? Ken said we should have regulated social media like crazy. We didn't do it. We are going to look down on AI like 10 years down the road, and we should have regulated like we didn't do it. So, I mean, clearly we are not doing it, but if we were to do it, what would be the regulation to break that loop you showed us, which is very impressive?
Great. I think this is a really important question. My guess is that it could be two types of regulation. One is AI regulation for other reasons than this cycle that, for example, let's take Ken's example of social media. If we have other reasons for wanting to regulate AI that go beyond the economics of it, so that could be one way to kind of break the cycle, or one thing that could break the cycle. I think another policy would be just if we did have some redistribution in place that at least prevents inequality from getting way out of hand. If we start, I mean, maybe this is 10, 20 years down the road, but if we have some kind of super intelligence that starts en masse getting rid of jobs, then presumably at the very latest at that stage, do we want a policy in place that redistributes the gains from AI? That I think could also cause this to slow down the cycle and not go too extreme.
Ludwig, can I hop on that?
Yeah.
Why do you assume? You sort of said, well, right now it sort of seems like this is going to be another example of skill bias technological change, but I think there's arguments that it might not be. And so why do you feel, none of us know,
No,
we're all
exactly.
guessing.
Yeah.
But I actually feel like
think
it's obviously going to hit people with certain skills, and, just like the two high skill, low skill model is going to be inadequate, but I don't know in the end it would.
I don't think we know yet,
inequality.
right?
Yeah.
I think what we have, the only data that I could find that I would trust is the fact that the labor share kept falling. Now, not
Yeah,
all of that
yeah.
is due to AI, but at least it's in line with a mechanism like that. I've seen different studies that have
course.
focused on what AI does, but none of them have, to my mind at least, in my mind at least, risen to the level of significance where I'm like, I know what it's going to do to inequality. There's been widely cited paper by Ilundu et al. That tries to measure sort of at the task level, what are LLMs good at. It kind of, when I think about their main figure, it kind of suggests that what it's going to do, it's going to hollow out a little more the middle class, maybe the upper middle class.
Yeah, more than the
More
past,
than in the past. And that, I think, is kind of what I think seems plausible. I don't think it's going to, hollow out the jobs of the, best lawyers, because presumably the best lawyers have skills that are much harder for the average LLM to replicate, right, than sort of the mediocre lawyers.
Yeah, and I was just
So
thinking-
that's kind of where this was coming from. Now, but as I mentioned in the talk, the jury is out. We don't
Right.
know yet what it's going to do to inequality, but I think it's an interesting scenario to think about.
It's interesting, your graph on the rise of the top 1% and how obviously there was certain dynamics during COVID, but that it has really sort of bounced back since COVID, taken alongside some of the work by David Autor and Aaron Dubé, finding tightness at the bottom as well for 10th percentile, low wage
Yeah.
jobs. It kind of seems like the losers are people in the middle almost more than
Right.
just thinking about inequality as this linear thing and money just gets transferred from the bottom toward the top. It really seems like there's
Right, like within the fraction of income going to labor, what they
Yeah.
pointed out, right, was that the bottom seemed to
is
be doing quite
because
well.
of, they credit tight labor
Exactly.
markets and sort of running
Yeah.
the economy hot. But it's, I don't know the latest number,
Sure.
but for a good 6-7 years, it seemed like there were gains to the bottom alongside the, continued rise of the 1%. So that's an, I think, interesting thing to keep an eye on. I think political stability is especially sensitive to what's going on with the middle class.
100%.
Yes, May?
I've got.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
Yes,
No, I'd like
please
to
go
ask
ahead.
Julia if you factored in virtual work, the idea that many people work for home and therefore they're less mobile, not because they're locked in, but because they work from computers, they work from telephone, and many employers allow you to work from home. And just a brief comment on the concern that raising taxes on the 1% might lead to the additional tax evasion. I really doubted my conversations with tax lawyers. I'm a lawyer, is that evasion strategies have really maxed out, and certainly post-Epstein, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on, Congress will take a look at closed loopholes.
I'll believe it when I see it.
But I thought auditing rates went down, so
Yeah, I don't know.
We'll see.
I feel like the royal family might be targeted by Epstein investigations, but so far the U.S. Elite seem pretty immune. But sorry, my little Epstein interjection. Please continue.
Right. Right. So I think what work from home's going to do, it breaks the link between mobility and labor reallocation, right? So maybe lock-in still affects mobility. It still affects whether I want to sell my house, but then that doesn't have the same impacts on which workers are doing which jobs. So where we're going to best be able to get at this is with, the paper that's not out yet, where we're going to be actually able to measure job switching, right? So we're actually seeing whether someone's going to be switching jobs. Mm-hmm. To the extent that remote work is allowing them to, switch jobs without actually moving, that's just going to dampen what we're going to see. We're just not going to see lock-in have any bite on that. It seems like we do see it have some bite. So it suggests that there are limitations to what work from home can do. What I would also love to do is put that on the left-hand side, see if lock-in is increasing, people's desire to work from home. And we're still working on how to best measure that, but I think that's an interesting question to think about.
Julia, you seem to be to get hit a lot. It's very interesting to hear you talk about housing lock-in, which reminds me of a parallel phenomenon in the healthcare sector. It's called job lock. that people stay in a job because they're afraid to leave because the next job may not offer health insurance or may not offer as favorable health insurance as what they have. And that has a cost to it. And so I would assume that similarly, there is also an economic cost of lock-in both housing lock-in and healthcare job lock. Is this something that's worthwhile looking into, the economic cost to the economy, to GDP, because of the inefficiency it causes in labor allocation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of reasons to think that it's a little weird to do all of that, provision of health insurance through employers, and you're hitting on an important one, which is you're going to reduce, job switching. Our work's not going to directly speak to that, but one lesson that maybe we can take more broadly is how important mobility is, right? So we're going to be thinking very broadly about how important is workers being willing to switch jobs for the economy. And housing is definitely not the only thing that can lock you in. You're very right that, things like healthcare and benefits can lock you in as well. And even within housing, mortgage rates are not the only thing that can lock you in. Negative equity, property taxes, lots of things. But hopefully there are broader lessons to be learned about the importance of worker mobility for labor markets that we can derive from this setting.
It gives me a chance to plug up a recent paper from a former student who looks at the provision in the Obamacare legislation that allows kids to stay on their parents' insurance up until age 26. And so she and co-authors find that now that you're allowed to keep your kid on this long, it reduces job-to-job transitions among parents with kids who are of the age range where they're depending. And after the kid turns 26, there's nothing you can do to help anymore, and you see a rise in parental job-to-job switching. So there's all sorts of frictions, as you were saying, but job lock via healthcare is sort of a uniquely American one. Mm-hmm. Any further questions? Yes.
Thank you. Professor Fonseca, I was wondering, in regards to the effects that you saw, was there an urban-rural split? And if there was this largely caused by structural reasons such as remote work or the differences in the commercial housing market or rental housing market, or was it more due to informational differences?
So there's more lock-in in cities, but I think there's perhaps a more basic reason. Not that the other reasons that you're listing aren't there, but there is one very basic reason, which is the more dollars you have at stake, the more lock-in it's going to bite. The larger your mortgage, the more you're going to be deterred by having to reset your rate. And just sort of mechanically, where housing is more expensive, you're going to have more lock-in. And so in rural areas where mortgage balances are going to be lower, you just see, even relative to income, they're lower. Mm-hmm. So you just see a little bit less of that lock-in. But there are perhaps other structural reasons as well.
Professor Straub, I had a question. So I was wondering, so from a national accounting perspective, in a closed economy, it should be that savings equal to investment. So I was wondering how debt enters that picture.
Great. So the way it would work is if the rich get an increased share of income and would like to disproportionately increase their saving, then there's only, exactly as you say, in a closed economy, only two things that can happen. One is investment increases, and the other is the saving of somebody else in the economy decreases, right? So that overall saving doesn't change. And that's exactly what, to some extent, the U.S. is not a closed economy, but to some extent what we have seen and documented in our work, that while there has been an increase in saving by the rich, there was decreased saving by the poor. And that came in the form of increased household debt. So that's, now if you add to this that in fact the U.S. economy is not closed, at the same time there were actually inflows into the U.S. economy, that can explain why the saving rate actually went down rather than not changing over time. So add that to the picture, and then you get the full set of results.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Unless there's further questions, I think our panel can end exactly on time, and we can deliver you to lunch on the original schedule. Before we take off for lunch, let me just thank one more time our panelists, Ludwig, Julia, and Alexandre. Thank you so much for your contributions to the conference and to the panel in particular. And shall I close it now for lunch and invite everybody to grab a box lunch?